A virgin mountain man fell for a girl he can't touch. Then this happened. High in the frozen Colorado peaks, a lonely trapper finds a half-dead woman buried in the snow. He saves her life, but she carries a brand of shame and a past that could destroy them both. As the fire warms her hands, something awakens in his heart, something he's sworn never to feel again. He's the mountain's most feared recluse, a man who's taken a vow never to touch another soul. Yet the more he protects her, the closer temptation draws. Then, one night, the sheriff comes riding with torches and lawless men, claiming she's his property, and that mountain or no mountain, he'll burn it all to the ground to get her back. Now faith and desire collide on the edge of a frozen world. Can a man who swore never to touch love someone enough to risk his soul? And when purity meets fire, what will be left standing in the ashes? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The wind howled through the San Juan Mountains like a hungry wolf, whipping snow into ghostly shapes across the darkening Colorado sky. Ethan Boone hunched lower in his saddle, his broad shoulders braced against the growing storm. His horse, Thunder, picked its way carefully along the narrowing trail as evening shadows crept between the towering pines. The first flakes had started falling just after noon, but now, with dusk settling in, the storm had grown into something fierce and wild. Ethan could barely see 10 feet ahead through the thickening curtain of white. His cabin wasn't far, maybe a quarter-mile up the ridge, but in weather like this, even familiar paths could turn treacherous. Thunder's hooves crunched through the fresh powder, the sound muffled by the constant moan of wind through the trees. Ethan's fingers, though protected by thick leather gloves, had gone numb hours ago. The trapline would have to wait until the storm passed. Right now, getting home was all that mattered. Suddenly, Thunder's ears pricked forward. The horse stopped dead, pawing at the snow-covered ground. Ethan leaned forward, straining to hear whatever had caught his mount's attention. For a long moment, there was nothing but the whistle of wind and the soft pat of snow against his coat. Then, there it was. A sound so faint he almost missed it. Something human. A whimper, maybe, or a cry for help. "Whoa, boy," Ethan murmured, swinging down from the saddle. His boots sank knee-deep in the fresh powder. "What did you hear?" Thunder nickered softly, turning his head toward a drift-covered shape off the trail. Ethan's heart quickened. Through the swirling snow, he could just make out the dark bulk of an overturned wagon, half buried in white. "Hello?" he called out, his voice nearly lost in the wind. "Anyone there?" No answer came, but Thunder remained fixed on that spot. Ethan trudged forward, each step a battle against the deepening snow. As he drew closer, his stomach clenched. There, partially covered by a drift, lay a crumpled form. A woman. Young, from what little he could see of her face. She lay frighteningly still, her skin nearly as pale as the snow around her. Ethan dropped to his knees beside her, quickly brushing away the snow that had begun to cover her. Her clothes were soaked through, her lips tinged blue. But when he pressed 2 fingers to her throat, he found a pulse, weak and thready, but there. "Thank the Lord," he breathed. She was alive, but wouldn't be for long in this cold. Without hesitation, Ethan shrugged off his heavy coat and wrapped it around her slight form. Then, gathering her carefully in his arms, he lifted her from the snow. She felt light as a child, though she was clearly full-grown. Thunder stood steady as Ethan approached, understanding the urgency in his master's movements. With practiced care, Ethan mounted, cradling the unconscious woman against his chest. The cold bit deeper now without his coat, but he barely noticed. All that mattered was getting her to shelter before the storm could claim another victim. The final quarter-mile to his cabin seemed to stretch endlessly, but Thunder knew the way even in the growing dark. Finally, the familiar shape of Ethan's home emerged from the swirling white, a solid log structure backed against a cliff face for protection from the worst mountain winds. Ethan's arms trembled with cold and effort as he carried the woman inside. The cabin was cold and dark, but he knew every inch by heart. Gently laying her on his bed, he moved quickly to the fireplace. His fingers fumbled with the tinderbox, but soon a spark caught. Within minutes, a strong fire blazed, pushing back the darkness and cold. In the growing light, he got his first clear look at his unexpected guest. She was young, perhaps in her mid-20s, with dark hair frosted with ice. Her clothes, though well-made, were torn and frozen stiff. Most worrying were her hands, angry red with patches of white that spoke of dangerous frostbite. Ethan worked through the night, remembering everything he'd learned about treating cold exposure during his years in the mountains. He carefully warmed her hands in lukewarm water, gradually increasing the temperature. He placed hot rocks wrapped in cloth near her feet and core, but not too close. Too much heat too fast could be as dangerous as the cold itself. Hour by hour, color slowly returned to her face. Her breathing grew stronger, more regular. Still, Ethan didn't rest. He kept the fire well fed, prepared warming broth, and prayed, something he hadn't done properly in years. As false dawn began to lighten the cabin's single window, the woman stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then widening with sudden fear. "Mira," she whispered, voice rough with cold and fear. Then, "Are you one of them?" The terror in her voice cut straight to Ethan's heart. "No, ma'am," he said softly, keeping his distance so as not to frighten her further. "Name's Ethan Boone. Found you in the snow last night. You're safe here." She tried to sit up, then fell back with a weak cry as pain flashed across her face. "My hands." "Frostbitten," Ethan explained gently. "I've been treating them through the night. They should heal, but you'll need to be careful with them for a while." The woman, Mira, she'd said, looked around the cabin, taking in the rough but clean interior. Her gaze lingered on the cross carved into the mantelpiece, then returned to study Ethan's face. Whatever she saw there seemed to ease some of her fear. "I have some broth warming," Ethan said, moving slowly to the fireplace where a pot hung from an iron hook. "Think you could manage a little?" She nodded, though wariness still shadowed her eyes. Ethan helped her sit up, propping her with his spare pillow. When he handed her the tin cup, her fingers trembled so badly she could barely hold it. Without comment, he steadied it for her, letting her sip slowly. The howl of wind outside had grown even fiercer. Snow pelted against the window, and drafts found their way through the well-chinked logs despite Ethan's best efforts. The storm had sealed them in together, at least for now. "Thank you," Mira said finally, her voice stronger, "for saving my life." Ethan nodded, taking the empty cup. Anyone would have done the same. "No," she said, something dark passing behind her eyes. "Not anyone." The way she said it made Ethan wonder what had driven her out into such weather, alone and unprepared. But he didn't ask. Questions could wait. For now she needed rest and warmth, and the safety of 4 solid walls between her and whatever she was running from. "Try to sleep some more," he suggested, adding another log to the fire. "Storm's got us trapped for a spell anyway. When you're stronger, we can figure out what comes next." Mira nodded, her eyes already growing heavy. But before sleep claimed her again, she murmured, "Mr. Boone, why do they call you the Virgin of Silver Ridge?" Ethan froze for a moment, surprised she'd heard that name. Then he managed a small smile. "That's a story for another time, ma'am. Rest now. You're safe here." As Mira drifted off, Ethan settled into his chair by the fire. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside his cabin something else stirred. Something he'd thought long buried under years of solitude and guilt. A feeling he didn't dare name, even to himself. He watched the flames dance, listening to Mira's steady breathing, and wondered what tomorrow would bring. For now, though, his duty was clear. Keep her warm, keep her safe, and pray that whatever she was running from wouldn't follow her trail to his door once the storm cleared. Morning crept into the cabin with unusual silence. The howling wind that had raged through the night had finally stilled, leaving only the soft crackle of the hearth and the weight of fresh snow pressing against the world outside. Ethan stirred from his chair, where he'd dozed fitfully through the night. His neck ached from the awkward position, but his first thought was for his guest. Mira slept peacefully now, her breathing steady and strong. Color had returned to her cheeks, though her hands still showed angry patches of frostbite. He moved quietly to check the fire, adding fresh logs from his well-stocked pile. The familiar motions of morning followed. Coffee set to boil, cornmeal mush warming in a pot, snow melted for washing. Through it all, he found his gaze drawn back to Mira's sleeping form, wondering what circumstances had driven her into that deadly storm. When she finally woke, the sun had climbed high enough to paint diamonds across the snow-covered window. "What time is it?" she asked, voice still rough with sleep. "Near about 9, I reckon," Ethan replied, pouring coffee into a tin cup. "How are your hands feeling?" Mira tried to flex her fingers and winced. "Like they're full of needles." "That's good. Means feeling's coming back?" He brought her the coffee, helping her wrap her tender fingers around the warm metal. "Need to keep them warm, but not too hot. We'll do another soak after you've eaten something." As he helped her sit up, her collar shifted slightly. There, just visible at the base of her neck, was a scar that made his breath catch, a cross deliberately burned into her flesh. Mira noticed his gaze and quickly pulled the fabric higher, turning away. Ethan pretended not to have seen, though his jaw tightened at the implications of such a mark. "Reckon we're stuck here a spell," he said instead, spooning out portions of the cornmeal mush. "Storm's dropped at least 3 feet of fresh snow. Trail won't be passable for days." Something like relief flickered across Mira's face before she could hide it. "I'm sorry to impose on your hospitality." "No imposition," Ethan assured her. "Got plenty of supplies laid in for winter, and it's good to have company, truth be told. Been a while since I shared breakfast with anyone but Thunder." "Thunder?" "My horse. Known him longer than most folks around here." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "Do you always name your animals after weather?" "Only the loud ones," Ethan replied, surprising himself with the attempt at humor. It earned him a real smile this time, small but genuine. They fell into an unexpectedly comfortable routine over the next 2 days. Ethan tended to her frost-bitten hands with careful patience, showing her how to exercise them gently as feeling returned. He kept the fire well fed, helped her walk short distances when her strength began returning, and gave her space when she needed it. Bit by bit, her story emerged in fragments. Her father had been a traveling preacher, carrying the word to small settlements across the territory. "He believed in a gentle God," she said softly, watching the flames dance one evening. "One who lifted up the broken-hearted, who offered mercy before judgment." "Sounds like a good man," Ethan observed quietly. Mira nodded. He was, but he wasn't very practical. When he died last spring, I discovered he'd borrowed heavily to help families in need. The debts. She swallowed hard. A man named Rand Crowley offered to settle them, in exchange for marriage. Ethan's hands stilled where he was mending a piece of harness. The saloon owner from Silver Creek? You know him? Know of him, Ethan replied carefully. Crowley's reputation had reached even his isolated cabin, a man who used the law when it suited him and ignored it when it didn't. Mira's fingers traced the high collar of her borrowed shirt. Though she didn't speak of the scar, her meaning was clear enough. I couldn't stay, she whispered. When I heard him planning to expand his business to Durango, I took my chance, borrowed a wagon from a sympathetic neighbor. But the storm... She shook her head. If you hadn't found me. But I did, Ethan said firmly. The Lord guides our steps even in the darkest night. The words surprised him as much as her. He hadn't spoken of faith so freely in years, not since that terrible day in Kansas that had driven him to these mountains. Yet something about Mira's presence made the old truths rise naturally to his lips. He found himself avoiding her eyes more and more as the days passed, afraid of what might show in his own. The gentle way she spoke, her quiet strength in the face of suffering, the grace with which she accepted help without shame, it stirred something in his heart he'd thought long buried under grief and guilt. On the third night, as the fire burned low and snow continued to blanket the world outside, Ethan found himself drawn to the shelf where his father's Bible lay. The leather was worn smooth by years of handling, the pages marked with generations of notes in the margins. Would you read? Mira asked softly from her place by the fire. It's been so long since I heard the words spoken aloud. Ethan hesitated, then opened to the Psalms. His voice was rough at first, unpracticed, but grew stronger as he read, The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. When he finished, the silence held a different quality than before. Mira's eyes glistened in the firelight. Your voice, she whispered. It sounds like home. The words pierced him like an arrow. How long had it been since he'd prayed aloud, since he'd shared these beloved verses with another soul? The familiar guilt rose up. He had no right to speak holy words, not after what he'd done. Yet Mira's presence made him want to try, made him wonder if perhaps there was mercy even for him. She must have seen something of his struggle in his face, for she reached out carefully, her healing fingers just brushing his sleeve. Thank you, she said simply, for everything. Ethan nodded, not trusting his voice. The fire popped and sparked, sending shadows dancing across the cabin walls. Outside, the snow continued to fall, but inside, something else was falling. Walls built by years of solitude, barriers erected against hope itself. Neither of them spoke of it, this fragile thing growing between them. It was too new, too tender to bear the weight of words. But as Ethan added another log to the fire and settled back in his chair, he found himself offering up the first real prayer he'd managed in years. Lord, help me be worthy of this trust. The storm broke at dawn, leaving behind a world transformed. Sunlight blazed across endless white, so bright it hurt to look at directly. Ethan stood on his cabin's porch, squinting at the pristine expanse that had buried every familiar landmark. Even the split-rail fence was just a subtle ridge in the snow's surface. It's beautiful, Mira said softly, joining him at the railing. She had borrowed one of his wool shirts, the sleeves rolled up several times to free her hands. Though I reckon there's a lot of work ahead. Ethan nodded, studying the drifts that reached nearly to his waist. Need to clear paths to the barn and water first. Check on the animals. Let me help, Mira offered. When he started to protest, she raised her chin stubbornly. I can't just sit idle while you do all the work. You've saved my life and cared for me these past days. Please, let me repay some small part of that debt. Something in her determined expression reminded him of his mother, who'd never let illness or hardship keep her from her share of ranch work. After a moment's hesitation, he nodded. Reckon there's plenty needs doing. They started with the barn, Ethan breaking trail while Mira followed in his footsteps. His old hound dog, Bear, bounded through the drifts beside them, sending up plumes of powder with each leap. Inside, Thunder nickered a greeting while Bear shook himself vigorously, spattering them both with melting snow. First rule of mountain living, Ethan said, reaching for the feed bucket. Animals eat before people do. He showed her how to measure out Thunder's grain and Bear's dried meat, explaining the importance of regular schedules. Mira listened intently, her face bright with interest as she scratched Bear's ears. He's a good dog, she observed, as Bear leaned happily against her leg. How long have you had him? Found him as a pup, maybe 4 years back. Mother'd been caught in a trap. Ethan's voice held old anger at the memory. I don't set leg holds myself. Too cruel. Use snares mostly for rabbits and such. Could you show me how they work? Mira asked. I should learn if I'm to survive up here. Ethan glanced at her sharply, wondering if she meant to stay in the mountains, but her expression gave nothing away. Still, he found himself agreeing, and after the barn chores were done, he demonstrated how to check and reset the snare lines that helped keep his larder full. It's all in the wrist, he explained, showing her how to bend the wire just so. Too tight, nothing trips it. Too loose, they slip right through. Mira's first attempts were clumsy, her fingers still tender from frostbite, but she kept at it until she could make a passable loop. Her quiet determination touched something in Ethan's chest, making it hard to look directly at her. The waterhole came next. Ethan had chosen his cabin site carefully, building near a spring-fed pool that rarely froze solid. Still, they had to break through a thick crust of ice to reach the water below. He showed Mira how to use the long-handled dipper to fill their buckets without getting too close to the treacherous edge. The ice can be thin where you least expect it, he warned. Best to... Before he could finish, Mira's foot slipped. She caught herself, but not before her bucket tipped, sending icy water cascading down her skirt. She gasped at the shock, then started laughing as the fabric instantly began to stiffen in the cold. Oh, it's like wearing a barrel! She tried to walk, her frozen skirt rattling with each step. Ethan couldn't help but smile at the sight. Better get you back inside before you turn into an icicle yourself. They hurried back to the cabin, Mira's skirt creaking comically the whole way. Once inside, she disappeared behind the blanket he'd hung for privacy to change into dry clothes, while he built up the fire and started a pot of stew. The day's work had left them both hungry, and they ate in comfortable silence as darkness gathered outside. Bear sprawled near the hearth, occasionally thumping his tail when one of them would toss him a bit of meat. May I ask you something? Mira said finally, setting aside her empty bowl. Ethan nodded, though something in her tone made him wary. Why do you live alone up here? The people in Silver Creek, they call you the Virgin of Silver Ridge, but no one seems to know why. The fire popped loudly in the silence that followed. Ethan stared into the flames, considering how much to tell. But Mira had trusted him with her story. He owed her the same honesty. I wasn't always a trapper, he said slowly. Used to work as a gunsmith in Kansas. Had a shop in Lawrence, made a good living at it. Was proud of my work, every piece perfectly balanced, reliable. His hands moved unconsciously, remembering the feel of metal and wood. Then came the war between Kansas and Missouri. Border raiders, bushwhackers, revenge killings back and forth. He paused, the memories still sharp after all these years. There was a fight in town. 2 men arguing over cattle theft. Both were carrying guns I'd made. Fine weapons, accurate as could be. When they drew, a woman was crossing the street behind them. Mary Beth Collins, minister's wife. She was... His voice roughened. She was carrying her baby. Mira's hand flew to her mouth, but she didn't speak. The bullet went through her heart, dead before she hit the ground. The baby... He had to stop, swallow hard. The baby survived. Her husband raised him alone. "Oh, Ethan," Mira whispered. "It wasn't your fault. My guns, my craftsmanship, my pride in making weapons that could kill so clean and true." He shook his head. "I left that night. Rode until I couldn't anymore. Ended up here. Made a vow. Never again would I cause harm. Never again would I let pride or passion rule my actions." "Is that why you live apart? Why you've never married?" "Part of it. Figured the surest way to keep from hurting others was to keep to myself. And..." He gestured vaguely. "Physical desire. It leads to pride, to possession, to violence. Better to stay pure. Focus on simple things, working wood instead of metal, helping travelers when I can, living quiet." "But you helped me," Mira said softly. "You touched my heart without laying a hand." Ethan went absolutely still, staring into the fire. The words seemed to echo in the cabin's silence, stirring feelings he'd locked away years ago. Desire, yes, but something deeper, a longing for connection he'd denied himself for so long. "I'm sorry," Mira said quickly. "I shouldn't have..." "No," he interrupted, his voice rough. "Don't apologize. You speak truth, even when it's hard to hear." He took a steadying breath. "Maybe that's why the Lord sent you here, to remind me that there's more than one kind of purity." They sat quietly then, watching the fire burn low. Outside, a lone coyote called into the night, its voice carrying clear and wild across the snow-hushed valley. Bear's ears pricked up, but he didn't move from his place by the hearth, content in the warmth of their company. Ethan found himself acutely aware of Mira's presence, not just physically, but spiritually. Her quiet strength, her resilient faith despite all she'd suffered, challenged his carefully constructed walls. He'd thought isolation was the answer, but watching her these past days had shown him a different kind of courage, the bravery to remain open to life's possibilities, even after being hurt. The fire needed tending, but neither of them moved to add wood, as if afraid to break the delicate moment. In the deepening shadows, Mira's cross-shaped scar caught the firelight, no longer a mark of shame, but a testament to survival, to hope. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the pines when the sound first reached them. Hoofbeats, distant but drawing closer, echoing off the snow-laden branches. Ethan had been showing Mira how to repair a broken chair leg, but now he straightened, his expression alert. Moving to the window, he pushed the curtain aside just enough to see down the trail. 3 riders were approaching, their horses picking their way carefully through the deep snow. The man in front sat tall in the saddle, his silver badge catching the winter light. Behind him rode 2 others, rough-looking men with rifles across their laps. "Sheriff Crowley," Mira whispered, her face gone pale as chalk. She'd come to look too, but now stumbled backward, nearly knocking, over the chair they'd been mending. "Quick now," Ethan said quietly. "Behind the bed curtain. Stay still no matter what you hear." Mira didn't argue. She slipped behind the heavy wool curtain that sectioned off the sleeping area, her skirts barely disappearing from view when the first knock came at the door. Ethan took his time responding, deliberately wiping his hands on his work apron and setting his tools aside. He opened the door with the same unhurried calm he'd use for any visitor. "Sheriff," he said, nodding politely. "Didn't expect to see law enforcement up this high, especially after that storm." Rand Crowley's smile didn't reach his eyes. He was a handsome man in an obvious way, clean-shaven, well-dressed, with a watch chain glinting across his vest. But there was something in his gaze that reminded Ethan of mountain cats he'd seen. Beautiful, yes, but purely predatory. "Mr. Boone," Crowley said, touching the brim of his hat. "Sorry to trouble you, but I'm retrieving some stolen property that might have passed this way." "Stolen property?" Ethan kept his voice mild, interested but not too interested. "My bride-to-be seems to have gotten cold feet." Crowley's smile widened slightly. "Took off with a wagon full of supplies that didn't belong to her. Would have frozen to death in that blizzard if someone hadn't helped her." "That so?" Ethan leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms. "Haven't seen any wagons lately. Storm kept me pretty close to home." One of Crowley's men spat into the snow. "Wagon tracks leading right up here, boss, before the fresh snow covered 'em." "Indeed?" Crowley's eyes never left Ethan's face. "Mind if my men take a look around? Just to be thorough." "Your badge gives you that right," Ethan said evenly, "but seems a shame to stand out here in the cold while they search. I've got coffee on the stove if you'd care to step in." It was a calculated risk. Crowley would be suspicious if Ethan tried to keep him out of the cabin, but inside, the sheriff's attention would be on Ethan himself, not on searching too carefully. "Much obliged," Crowley said, following Ethan inside while his men headed for the barn. The cabin was warm from the wood stove, filled with the rich scent of coffee and wood shavings. Ethan moved deliberately, getting down 2 tin cups, pouring the coffee with steady hands. He was acutely aware of Crowley's eyes taking in every detail: the half-mended chair, the single plate from Ethan's lunch, the Bible on the table. "Living quite the monk's life up here," Crowley observed, accepting the coffee. "Must get lonely." "I keep busy enough." Ethan sat across from him, taking a slow sip from his own cup. "Trapping? Carpentry work? Looking after my stock?" "Yes, I've heard about you. The Virgin of Silver Ridge." Crowley's tone made the nickname sound like a joke. "They say you took some kind of vow. No women, no violence, almost like a priest." He paused. "But then, even priests can be tempted to break their vows for a pretty face." "I suppose that's between them and their God," Ethan replied calmly. The sheriff's men clattered back in, shaking snow from their boots. "Nothing in the barn, boss. Just his horse and some traps." "Well?" Crowley set down his half-finished coffee and stood. "Appreciate your hospitality, Mr. Boone. But let me leave you with a friendly warning." His voice hardened. "If she is up here, she won't survive what's coming. I'll burn this mountain clean before I let her make a fool of me." He adjusted his gun belt, a casual gesture that wasn't casual at all. "Good day to you." Ethan saw them to the door, watched them mount up and ride away. He stayed outside longer than necessary, making sure they were truly gone, using the time to master the anger that had been building in his chest. Only when the last hoofbeat had faded did he go back inside. Mira emerged from behind the curtain, trembling so hard she could barely stand. Ethan wanted to go to her, to offer comfort, but he kept his distance, giving her space to steady herself. "He'll be back," she said, wrapping her arms around herself. "He won't stop until he finds me." "Why?" Ethan asked quietly. "What claim does he truly have on you?" Mira's hand went to her neck, to the cross-shaped scar that Ethan had noticed before. "My father. He was a good man, a preacher who believed in helping others. But the drought came, and the bank was threatening to take the church property. Crowley offered to pay off the debt, said all he wanted in return was to court me properly. Her voice shook. But after Father died, everything changed. Crowley said I belonged to him now, that the debt made me his property. She turned away, but not before Ethan saw the tears on her cheeks. When I refused to marry him, he said he'd mark me as his own, heated his deputy's badge in the fire and... Her fingers traced the scar. Said if I wouldn't wear his ring, I'd wear his brand instead. The silence that followed her words was heavy with horror and grief. Ethan's hands had curled into fists without his conscious intent. All his vows of non-violence seemed hollow in the face of such deliberate cruelty. The worst part wasn't the pain, Mira whispered. It was how he quoted scripture while he did it, like he thought God approved. She looked up at Ethan, her eyes bright with unshed tears. How can a man who claims to serve the law be so lawless in his heart? Power corrupts, Ethan said softly, and men like Crowley twist everything good, law, scripture, love itself, into weapons to serve their pride. He crossed to the window, checking again that no riders lingered in the trees. You'll be safe here, he said firmly. I swear it. But your vow? My vow was never to stand idle in the face of evil. Ethan turned to face her. I promised not to harm through pride or passion, but protecting the innocent, that's a different kind of duty entirely. Mira met his gaze, and something passed between them. Understanding, trust, and perhaps something deeper that neither was ready to name. She nodded slowly. Thank you, she said simply. Outside, the wind had begun to rise again, carrying the promise of more snow. Ethan added wood to the stove, then began gathering supplies, extra ammunition for his rifle, dried food, bandages. He wouldn't break his vow against violence, but neither would he let Crowley's evil go unchallenged. As darkness fell, Bear's low growl alerted them to movement in the trees, but it was only a deer picking its way through the snow. Still, they kept the lamps turned low, speaking in whispers, acutely aware that somewhere out there, Crowley was planning his next move. The first gray light of dawn crept over the mountains, bringing with it the acrid smell of burning wood. Ethan stood at his cabin window, watching thin columns of black smoke rise from the valley below. His jaw tightened as he counted them. 3, then 4 separate fires, all set by Crowley's men. They're burning people out, he said quietly. Mira joined him at the window, her face pale in the dim light. Looking for me, she whispered. Those families, their homes. Crowley means to leave them nothing. Ethan turned away from the window, his movements quick but controlled as he began gathering supplies. We need to move. Now. He worked methodically, years of trapping experience guiding his choices. Into his pack went dried meat, hard biscuits, coffee, and beans. He rolled thick winter furs into tight bundles and counted out ammunition for his rifle, storing it carefully in an oiled leather pouch. Mira helped without being asked, her hands steady as she filled water skins and packed dried herbs for tea. But when Ethan handed her a pair of snowshoes, she paused, holding them like they were made of glass. We can't run forever, she said softly. The snow's deep, and Crowley knows these mountains. He has men, horses, supplies. Then we'll climb higher than sin can breathe. Ethan's voice held quiet conviction as he checked the bindings on her snowshoes. There's country up there where even the Indians don't go in winter. Crowley's men won't follow. And if they do, then we'll deal with that when it comes. He looked up at her, his eyes serious. But I won't let him cage you again. They worked quickly after that, loading essential supplies onto Ethan's most sure-footed mule. Bear, his old hound, whined softly until Ethan knelt beside him. "Stay here, boy," he murmured, scratching behind the dog's ears. "Guard the cabin. We'll come back when we can." The sun was just touching the highest peaks when they set out, breaking trail through knee-deep snow. Ethan led the way, setting a pace that Mira could maintain. The snowshoes took some getting used to, but she learned quickly, following in his tracks as they climbed steadily higher into the San Juans. The morning passed in a rhythm of careful steps and measured breathing. They stopped only briefly to drink from the water skins and chew on strips of dried meat. By noon, they'd gained enough elevation to look back over the valley. More smoke columns had joined the first ones, dark stains against the winter sky. "He's driving everyone out," Mira said, her voice tight with guilt. "All those families." "They'll rebuild," Ethan assured her. "Mountain folk are stubborn that way, and they won't forget who burned them out." He adjusted the mule's lead rope. "We need to keep moving. There's a cave I know, about 3 hours from here. We can shelter there tonight." The afternoon brought deeper snow and steeper terrain. They climbed through stands of wind-twisted pine, their branches heavy with white. The air grew thinner, each breath sharp with cold. Mira stumbled once, twice, but refused Ethan's offer to rest. "I won't be the reason we're caught," she said, pushing herself up. "I can keep going." Just before dusk, they reached the cave Ethan had spoken of, a deep crack in the mountainside, hidden behind a curtain of icicles. Inside, the temperature was barely above freezing, but at least they were out of the wind. Ethan built a small fire well back from the entrance, where the smoke would disperse through natural chimneys in the rock. They ate a simple meal of beans and biscuits, letting the warmth seep back into their bones. When Mira tried to take first watch, Ethan shook his head. "Sleep," he said gently. "You need it more than I do right now." She wanted to argue, but was too exhausted. Wrapping herself in one of the fur robes, she curled up near the fire. Soon her breathing deepened into sleep, but her rest was uneasy. Twice she cried out softly, her hand going to the scar on her neck. Ethan kept his vigil through the night, feeding small sticks to the fire and listening to the wind moan outside. He prayed quietly, not with formal words, but with the simple directness he'd learned in his years alone on the mountain. "Please, Lord, show us the way through this." They maintained this pattern for the next 2 nights, traveling by day, sheltering in caves or under rock ledges when darkness fell. Each day took them higher into the mountains, into country so wild and beautiful it made the heart ache. They saw elk moving through the trees like shadows, and once a mountain lion watched them pass, unafraid and curious. Mira grew stronger each day, more sure on her snowshoes, more comfortable with the rhythm of mountain travel. But the cold was taking its toll. Her lips had turned blue despite the fur wrap she kept pulled close, and her cough worried Ethan. On the 3rd day, they reached a high ridge that seemed to float above the world. The valley spread out below them like an ocean of snow, dotted with dark islands of pine forest. The sky stretched endless and blue above, so clear they could see 100 miles to the next range of mountains. Mira stood at the edge, her breath making clouds in the crystal air. Despite her blue-tinged lips, she smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes for the first time since Ethan had found her in the snow. "If we die up here," she said softly, "at least I'll die free." Ethan moved to stand beside her, close enough to catch her if she stumbled, but not so close as to crowd her space. "Nobody's dying," he said firmly. "But you're right about the freedom part." She turned to look at him, her face flushed with cold, and something else. Perhaps hope, or courage, or both. "Do you think God can see us up here?" "I reckon he sees us everywhere," Ethan replied. "But up here it's easier to remember that." The wind picked up, carrying ice crystals that sparkled like diamonds in the sun. Ethan checked the position of the sun, gauging the hours of daylight they had left. "There's another cave system ahead," he said, "bigger than the others, with hot springs deep inside. We can rest there, gather strength before we decide our next move." Mira nodded, adjusting her snowshoes. "Lead on, then." They set out across the ridge, two small figures in an immense landscape of white and blue. Behind them, their tracks filled slowly with fresh snow, erasing all signs of their passage. Above them, an eagle circled on thermal currents, its cry echoing off the ancient stones. They were not safe, not yet, but they were free, and for now that was enough. They moved steadily forward, step by step, into the heart of the high country where even angels might fear to tread. The fourth day dawned bitter cold, with wind that cut like knives through their furs. Ethan noticed Mira struggling more than usual, her steps becoming uncertain on the steep terrain. Her face was flushed, despite the chill, and she barely touched the dried meat he offered during their brief rest. "Just tired," she insisted when he asked if she was all right. But her voice had grown hoarse, and she couldn't seem to stop shivering. By late afternoon, dark clouds rolled in from the west, bringing the threat of more snow. Ethan was just about to suggest they find shelter when Mira stumbled and fell to her knees. This time she couldn't get back up. "Can't," she mumbled, her eyes glazed with fever. "So cold." Ethan pressed his hand to her forehead and cursed softly. She was burning up. Without hesitation, he gathered her into his arms, her body frighteningly light despite the layers of clothing. The mule would have to follow on its own. He couldn't waste time leading it. "Hold on," he murmured, cradling her close as he searched the gathering darkness. "Just hold on." He knew these mountains like the back of his hand, and somewhere in this maze of canyons was their only hope, Nijoni's place. The old Ute healer had helped him years ago when he'd taken a bad fall while checking his trap lines. If anyone could help Mira now, it would be her. The trail down into the canyon was treacherous, barely wide enough for a man's boots. Ethan picked his way carefully, using his shoulder to brush the canyon wall for guidance when the path curved. Mira drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes muttering words he couldn't understand, sometimes crying out as if trapped in fever dreams. "Shh," he soothed, though his arms ached, and his own breath came in ragged gasps from the effort. "Almost there." The canyon opened slightly, and through the growing darkness, Ethan spotted what he'd been praying for, a thin curl of smoke rising from a natural chimney in the rock face. Nijoni's home was built into the cliff itself, half cave and half cabin, with a small corral for goats carved out of the stone. As he approached, the door opened before he could knock. Nijoni stood in the doorway, her silver hair gleaming in the lamplight, her dark eyes taking in the situation at a glance. "The wind whispered you were coming," she said simply, stepping aside. "Bring her in." The interior was warm and smelled of sage and pine smoke. Dried herbs hung from the ceiling in neat bundles, and a fire burned steadily in a stone hearth. Nijoni directed Ethan to lay Mira on a bed of soft furs near the fire. "Fever sickness," Nijoni said, placing her weathered hand on Mira's forehead. "Too many days in the cold, too little rest." She began gathering herbs and bottles from her shelves. And something else. Something deeper. Ethan hovered uncertainly, wanting to help but not knowing how. "She's running from a man who hurt her," he explained. "We've been traveling hard." Nijoni nodded as she worked, crushing herbs in a stone mortar. "The body can burn with guilt as much as sickness," she said. "Sometimes the spirit needs healing before the flesh can mend." She mixed her herbs with hot water and honey, then began removing Mira's outer layers to apply cool cloths to her fever-hot skin. When she reached to loosen Mira's collar, she paused, seeing the cross-shaped scar on her neck. Her expression softened with understanding. "Ah," she breathed, touching the mark gently. "Little sister, what cruel hand marked you so?" She looked up at Ethan, her eyes full of ancient wisdom. "But shame does not mark the soul. Remember that." Ethan watched as Nijoni worked, her movements sure and practiced. She applied poultices to Mira's chest and throat, wrapped her in fresh blankets, and began to sing, low, rhythmic songs in her native tongue that seemed to fill the small space with peace. "These are healing songs," she explained between verses. "They call to the good spirits, ask them to chase away the darkness in body and mind." Hours passed. Ethan sat in a corner, unable to sleep, watching as Nijoni tended to Mira with a grandmother's care. The old healer seemed tireless, changing compresses, giving sips of medicine, singing her prayers. Sometimes she spoke to Mira in English, sometimes in Ute, her voice always gentle and sure. Near midnight, Mira's fever finally broke. Her breathing eased, and some of the flush left her cheeks. Nijoni nodded with satisfaction. "She will sleep now," she said, finally sitting down near the fire. She gestured for Ethan to join her. "Come, it's time we talked." Ethan moved closer to the fire, his joints stiff from sitting so long in one position. Nijoni studied him in silence for a moment, then spoke. "You carry a heavy burden, Ethan Boone. I see it in your eyes, in the way you watch her but will not let yourself draw near." She added a stick to the fire. "Tell me of this vow that chains your heart." Ethan stared into the flames, the old guilt rising in his throat. "I killed an innocent woman," he said roughly. "My gun, my bullet, even if I didn't pull the trigger. I swore then, never to harm again, never to—" He couldn't finish. "Never to love?" Nijoni's voice was gentle but firm. "And you think this honors the dead? To lock away the gift of life?" "It's not about honor," Ethan protested. "It's about penance." Nijoni shook her head. "The Great Spirit does not ask us to wall up our hearts as punishment. He asks us to learn, to grow, to heal." She gestured toward Mira's sleeping form. "That young woman bears scars, yet she reaches for life. Why do you think you deserve less?" Ethan had no answer. He watched Mira's peaceful breathing, remembering her smile on the high ridge, her courage in the face of fear. Something stirred in his chest. Something he'd been fighting since the day he found her in the snow. "I don't know how to be different," he admitted quietly. "Then learn," Nijoni said simply. "The path to healing is not walked alone." She rose, gathering fresh herbs for another poultice. "Rest now. Tomorrow will bring its own wisdom." Ethan settled back against the wall, his mind full of Nijoni's words. Across the room, Mira slept soundly, her face peaceful in the firelight. Outside, the wind had died down, and stars were beginning to peek through breaks in the clouds. In this moment of quiet, something inside him began to shift, like ice breaking up on a frozen river, letting light reach the waters below. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in years, his prayers were not about penance, but possibility. The mountain air had softened. 2 weeks of rest in Nijoni's cliffside sanctuary had brought healing to both body and spirit. Snow still blanketed the high country, but the afternoon sun now carried enough warmth to drip icicles from the rocky overhangs and turn the packed snow around the entrance to treacherous slush. Mira sat cross-legged by the fire, carefully sorting through the few belongings she'd managed to save from her overturned wagon. Her fingers were almost fully recovered from the frostbite, though they still ached in the cold. Nijoni had shown her how to make a salve from pine sap and herbs that helped ease the stiffness. "Your father's things?" Nijoni asked, settling beside her with a cup of wild mint tea. "Yes." Mira held up a worn leather Bible, its pages soft with use. "He carried this through the war, then all the way to Colorado, territory." She opened it carefully, touching the familiar handwriting on the flyleaf. "Sometimes I think I can still smell his pipe tobacco in the pages." Ethan paused in his work of repairing a broken snare, watching her from his place by the door. The afternoon light caught in her hair, bringing out hints of copper among the brown. She looked stronger now, the fever brightness in her eyes replaced by quiet determination. As Mira sifted through the small collection of letters and papers, something slipped from between the Bible's pages, a folded packet sealed with wax, yellow with age. She frowned, not recognizing it. "What's this?" She broke the seal carefully, unfolding what appeared to be several official documents. Her eyes widened as she read. "Oh, my word. What is it?" Ethan set aside his work and moved closer. It's a land deed." Mira's voice trembled with discovery. "Signed by the territorial governor himself, dated 15 years ago. It grants my father ownership of the entire Dawson Basin. The valley, the water rights, everything." She looked up, stunned. "I had no idea he owned any of it. He never said—" Nijoni leaned forward, her dark eyes intent. "The valley where the silver seeps from the mountains? Where my people's horses still drink?" "Yes." Mira spread the papers on her lap. "There's more. Letters between father and the governor about protecting the Ute water access. He wanted to ensure the tribe's rights were preserved, even if mining claims were filed." Ethan took the deed carefully, examining the official seals and signatures. "This is why Crowley's been so desperate to claim that land. Without legal title, he can't sell mining rights to the Eastern companies." His jaw tightened. "And why he tried to force you to marry him. He must have known about this deed. Or suspected it existed." Mira's fingers traced the cross-shaped scar on her neck. "When I refused him, She swallowed hard. "He said he'd break me until I gave him everything my father owned." Nijoni placed a weathered hand over Mira's. "But he did not break you, daughter. The Great Spirit made you stronger than iron." Mira squeezed the old woman's hand gratefully. "This changes everything," she said. "With this deed, we can stop Crowley legally. We can protect the valley, the water rights, everything my father wanted to preserve." She stood suddenly, energy crackling through her like lightning. "We have to take this to town, record it officially at the land office." "Town?" Ethan's voice was sharp with concern. "Mira, Crowley's men will be watching every trail. It's too dangerous." "More dangerous than letting him steal land that rightfully belongs to others? Than watching him burn out more families?" Mira clutched the deed to her chest. "My father died trying to protect what was right. I won't hide in these mountains while Crowley destroys everything he worked for." "She speaks truth," Nijoni said quietly. "A deed unrecorded is like a prayer unspoken. It holds power, but cannot act in the world." Ethan paced the small space, conflict clear in every line of his body. "At least wait until the passes are clear. Another week or two. By then it might be too late." Mira's voice was gentle but firm. "Spring means mining season. Once Crowley starts selling claims, it won't matter what papers we have." She stepped closer to him, close enough that he had to meet her eyes. "If faith is worth praying for, it's worth walking for." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Ethan stood very still, and Mira could almost see the struggle behind his eyes, the need to protect warring with deeper truths about courage and righteousness. Nijoni watched them both, her expression knowing. "The snow is melting," she observed. "The trail down to Silver Creek will be passable by morning." "Silver Creek?" Mira turned to her. "But that's 15 miles from the land office." "Yes," Nijoni nodded. "But there is a telegraph station there. You could send word to the territorial marshal, ask for protection before you ride into Dawson's Basin." Ethan's shoulders relaxed slightly. That might work. If we can get official witnesses waiting at the land office. Then Crowley couldn't stop us without breaking the law in front of federal authorities. Mira's eyes lit with hope. "He's a coward at heart. He won't risk that." "Maybe." Ethan didn't sound convinced. "But getting to Silver Creek won't be easy. The trail follows the river canyon, narrow, exposed. If his men spot us..." "Then we'll need to leave before dawn," Mira said decisively. Under cover of darkness, she began gathering her things, moving with renewed purpose. "I won't let fear of him rule my life anymore. This is our chance to make things right, not just for me, but for everyone he's hurt." Nijoni rose and went to her storage shelves, returning with packets of dried meat and herbs. "Take these. You will need strength." She pressed something else into Mira's hand, a small leather pouch on a cord. "And this. It carries prayers for protection, woven with the first light of morning." Mira hugged the old woman tightly. "Thank you. For everything." "Thank me by living bravely," Nijoni replied, "and by remembering that healing comes in many forms." Her wise eyes flickered to Ethan. "Sometimes through facing what we fear most." Ethan cleared his throat. "I'll check the tack. Make sure everything's ready." He headed outside, but paused in the doorway. "Mira." She looked up from her packing. "Yes?" "Your father would be proud." He said it quickly, almost gruffly, then disappeared into the gathering dusk. Mira stared after him, her heart beating a strange rhythm. Nijoni's soft chuckle made her turn. "He learns," the old woman said, stirring the fire. "Slowly, like spring melting winter, but he learns." "What do you mean?" "That sometimes the greatest act of protection is letting someone be brave," Nijoni smiled. "And that love is stronger than fear, when we give it room to grow." Mira felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I don't think... That is, he's made his feelings clear about such things." "Has he?" Nijoni raised an eyebrow. "Or has he only made clear his feelings about himself?" She patted Mira's hand. "Rest now. Tomorrow will need all your courage. And his." Outside, the spring wind sang through the canyon, carrying the scent of melting snow and new possibilities. The deed lay on Mira's lap, her father's last gift transforming from burden to blessing. Tomorrow they would ride for Silver Creek, carrying justice like a torch against the darkness. But tonight, in the warmth of Nijoni's fire, Mira allowed herself to feel something else growing beneath her determination, something as fragile and unstoppable as the first green shoots breaking through mountain snow. Dawn painted the mountains gold as Ethan inspected the old mule cart behind Nijoni's hut. His hands moved methodically over weathered wood and rusted metal, testing joints and wheels. The cart hadn't seen use in 2 winters, but its bones were sound. He worked through the morning, replacing cracked boards and greasing axles while Mira helped Nijoni prepare traveling supplies. "Reckon she'll hold?" Mira asked, bringing him a cup of coffee. Ethan ran his palm along a freshly replaced crossbeam. "She ain't pretty, but she's steady. Better than walking, anyway." He took the coffee gratefully, careful not to let their fingers brush. "We can hide the deed and provisions under these blankets, make it look like we're just running supplies." The sound of hoofbeats made them both tense. But it was only Nizhoni returning from checking the trail. She dismounted gracefully, despite her age, her dark eyes serious. "The path down is clear for now," she reported. "But there are fresh tracks in Silver Creek Valley. Crowley's men are still searching." Ethan nodded grimly. "Then we'll stick to the old hunting trails long as we can. Take it slow and quiet." They loaded the cart as the sun climbed higher. Food, blankets, ammunition, and medicine from Nizhoni. The deed itself they wrapped carefully in oilcloth and tucked into a false bottom Ethan had built into the cart's bed. Mira's Bible rode in her pocket, close to her heart. Nizhoni embraced them both before they left. "Remember," she said softly, "the longest road is the one between fear and trust. Walk it with open eyes." The first day's travel was steep and treacherous. Ethan led the mule while Mira walked alongside, both of them straining against the cart's weight on the downhill slope. The old hunting trail wound through dense pine forest, offering good cover but difficult passage. By sunset, they had descended perhaps 5 miles, and their muscles ached fiercely. They made camp in a sheltered hollow, keeping the fire small. While Ethan tended the mule, Mira prepared a simple supper of jerky and hard biscuits. The mountain, night closed around them like a blanket of stars. "Would you read?" Ethan asked quietly as they finished eating. "Been a while since I heard the word proper." Mira drew out her father's Bible, its leather soft with age. Her voice carried clearly in the still air as she read from Psalms. "The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear?" Ethan closed his eyes, letting the familiar verses wash over him. When she finished, the silence felt holy somehow, full of unspoken things. The second day brought them down into higher meadows, where winter's grip was already loosening. Here and there, patches of bare ground showed through the snow, and the air held hints of spring. But the signs of man's presence grew darker. They passed the charred remains of a homestead, its blackened beams reaching toward the sky like accusing fingers. "The Wilsons lived here," Ethan said softly. "Good folks. They refused to sell to Crowley's mining company." Mira touched the cross-shaped scar on her neck. "How many others has he driven out?" "Too many. Most folks hereabouts are gone now, scattered to Denver or Durango." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Some just disappeared." They pressed on, following the course of a frozen creek. The cartwheels creaked steadily, marking time like a heartbeat. That night they camped in the lee of a great boulder, and Mira read from the Gospel of John. Her voice trembled slightly over the words, "Perfect love casteth out fear." The third day's journey took them past more abandoned ranches, their empty windows staring like hollow eyes. Spring thaw had turned the trail muddy, making the going slower. Twice they had to stop and dig the cartwheels out of deep ruts. By afternoon, dark clouds were building over the western peaks. They made camp early, finding shelter in a stand of thick pines. While Ethan gathered firewood, Mira set about making their evening meal more substantial than usual. Corn dodgers and beans with the last of Nizhoni's dried herbs. The fire cast dancing shadows as they ate. Mira seemed lost in thought, watching the flames. Finally, she spoke so softly, Ethan almost missed it. "Do you ever dream of having a wife?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Ethan's hand froze with his cup halfway to his lips. Several heartbeats passed before he could answer. "Only," his voice was rough, "only in ways I pray forgiveness for." Mira's hand moved across the space between them, reaching toward his. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The fire's crackle, the wind in the pines, even his own breathing. But before their fingers could touch, Ethan drew back, his hand trembling. "I can't," he whispered. "My vow." Your vow was about violence, Mira said gently. About weapons and hurting. Love isn't violence, Ethan. Ain't it? His voice was harsh with pain. Seems to me love's hurt more folks than bullets ever did. That wasn't love. She looked at him steadily across the fire. That was pride, or greed, or fear, wearing love's face. Real love heals, like Christ's love heals. Ethan stood abruptly, pacing away from the fire. His shoulders were rigid with tension. I ain't worthy of that kind of talk, not after what I done. None of us are worthy. Mira's voice followed him into the darkness. That's why it's called grace. He stopped at the edge of the firelight, his back to her. For a long moment, only the pop and hiss of burning wood broke the silence. When he spoke again, his voice was barely audible. What if I can't tell the difference anymore? Between desire and devotion? Maybe they're not as separate as you think. Mira's words were soft but clear. Maybe true devotion includes loving what God puts in our path, not just what's safe to love. Ethan's hands clenched at his sides. Everything he'd built his life around these past years, his solitude, his certainty, his carefully maintained distance from human warmth, seemed to be crumbling like spring ice. And like spring ice, the melting terrified and thrilled him in equal measure. I should check the perimeter, he said roughly, and walked into the darkness. He stayed out longer than necessary, letting the cold mountain air clear his head. When he returned, Mira was already wrapped in her blankets, her breathing soft and regular, but her Bible lay open beside the fire, and in the dying light, he could just make out the verses she'd marked. For God hath not given us the spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. Ethan sat by the fire until dawn, watching over her sleep, his heart waging its own quiet war between what he feared and what he dared to hope. The fourth morning broke gray and cold, with snow threatening in the heavy clouds. They packed quickly and silently, each lost in their own thoughts. The cart seemed heavier somehow, weighted with all they'd left unspoken. But as they started down the trail, Mira's hand brushed his arm. Whatever comes, she said simply, I'm glad to be walking this road with you. Ethan couldn't answer, but something in his chest eased slightly, like a fist unclenching. They moved on together through the gathering storm, toward whatever waited in Silver Creek. Silver Creek emerged from the morning mist like a ghost town, its wooden buildings hunched against the cold. Snow dusted the mine tailings that rose behind the settlement in gray heaps. Most windows were dark, shuttered against winter's lingering grip. Only a thin trail of smoke from a few chimneys suggested any life remained. Ethan guided the cart down the rutted main street, past the silent assay office and the general store with its closed till spring sign. His eyes scanned constantly, marking each alley and doorway. Mira sat beside him, the deed pressed close against her chest beneath her coat. There, Ethan said softly, nodding toward a small wooden church that stood apart from the other buildings. Its white paint was weathered, but a brass cross still gleamed dully. Above the door, more importantly, smoke rose steadily from its chimney. They pulled up to the church's hitching post. Before Ethan could help her down, Mira had already jumped from the cart, her boots crunching in the crusty snow. She looked up at the church's humble face with something like wonder. It's just like Father's church back home, she whispered. The door opened as they approached, spilling lamplight onto the snow. A man in his 40s stood framed in the doorway, his black coat worn but neat, his beard shot through with gray. Kind eyes studied them from beneath heavy brows. Welcome, travelers, he said. I'm Reverend Josiah Cole. Come in out of the cold. The church's interior was simple but warm, heated by a pot-bellied stove that glowed cherry red. Wooden pews lined either side of a center aisle, and a plain wooden cross hung above the altar. The smell of coffee filled the air. "Not many folk pass through Silver Creek these days," Reverend Cole said, gesturing them toward chairs near the stove. "Especially not in winter." "We're grateful for the welcome, Reverend," Ethan said. He glanced at Mira, who nodded slightly. "Truth is, we need help. And maybe sanctuary for the night." Cole's expression grew serious as they explained their situation. He listened without interrupting as Ethan described finding Mira in the storm, and Mira spoke of her escape from Crowley. When she carefully unwrapped the deed, the preacher's eyes widened. "This changes everything," he said, studying the document. "With this filed properly in Durango, Crowley's whole house of cards comes down. No wonder he's been burning folks out." "Will you help us?" Mira asked. Cole nodded slowly. "I can write a letter of witness, testifying to the deed's authenticity and the circumstances. That'll carry weight with the county recorder." He looked up at them. "But Crowley's got friends in Durango. You'll need more than just paper to see this through." "We've got truth on our side," Mira said firmly. "And the Lord," Cole added with a slight smile. "Though I reckon he appreciates a loaded rifle now and then, too." He stood, straightening his coat. "You'll stay here tonight. Church might not look like much, but it's defensible if need be. I'll write that letter after supper." As afternoon faded toward evening, Cole helped them bring in supplies from the cart. The church's back room held a small kitchen and 2 narrow cots. While the Reverend prepared a simple meal of beans and cornbread, Mira explored the church proper, running her fingers over the smooth wood of the pews. Ethan watched her from the doorway, struck by how naturally she fit here in this holy place. The last rays of sun through the western windows caught her hair like a halo. Something in his chest ached at the sight. "She's got steel in her soul, that one," Cole said quietly beside him. "And grace to match." Ethan just nodded, not trusting his voice. They gathered around the kitchen's small table as evening settled in. Cole said grace, his weathered hands clasped around theirs. The simple meal tasted better than anything Ethan could remember. As they finished eating, Mira began to hum softly, an old hymn that seemed to rise naturally from her heart. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound. Her clear voice filled the kitchen with warmth. Without conscious thought, Ethan found himself joining in, his deeper tones blending with hers. He hadn't sung in years, not since that terrible day in Kansas. But here, in this moment, the music seemed to flow from some long-sealed spring in his soul. "That saves a wretch like me." Their voices twined together, rising towards the rafters. Cole sat back, eyes closed in appreciation. The harmony felt like a physical presence, as if heaven itself had cracked open above their heads, pouring down grace like golden light. "I once was lost, but now am found." Tears streaked Mira's cheeks, but she smiled as she sang. Ethan's own vision blurred, but he didn't look away. Something was breaking open inside him. Not the shattering he'd always feared, but more like ice giving way to spring, pain yielding to possibility. "Was blind, but now I see." The last note hung in the air like a blessing. For a long moment, none of them spoke, unwilling to break the spell. Finally, Cole cleared his throat. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," he said softly. "Sometimes he uses bullets and laws to achieve his ends. But more often, I reckon, he works through simple things. A meal shared, a song lifted up, 2 voices finding harmony." Ethan looked down at his rough hands, calloused from years of trapping and carpentry. "I ain't sung since that day. Didn't think I had the right anymore." "Maybe that's why the Lord sent you someone to sing with," Cole suggested gently. "Harmony's harder to make alone." Later, as Cole wrote the witness letter by lamplight, Ethan stood in the church proper, looking up at the wooden cross. The moon through the windows cast long shadows across the floor. He heard soft footsteps behind him. "Thank you," Mira said quietly, "for singing with me." "Hadn't planned to," Ethan admitted. "It just happened." "Like finding me in the storm just happened?" There was a smile in her voice. "Some things are meant to be, Ethan, even if we're scared of them at first." He turned to look at her. This woman who had somehow worked her way past all his carefully built walls. In the moonlight, she seemed to glow from within, strong and gentle all at once. "I'm still scared," he whispered. "I know." She stepped closer, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her presence. "But you're not alone anymore. Neither of us is." From the kitchen came the scratch of Cole's pen, putting their story to paper. Outside, the wind sighed through Silver Creek's empty streets. But here, in this simple house of God, Ethan felt something he hadn't dared feel in years. Hope, as fragile and precious as the first spring flower, pushing through mountain snow. They stood together in the moonlight, not touching but connected all the same, while their shared song seemed to echo still in the rafters above. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, the ride to Durango, the confrontation with Crowley, the fight for justice. But for now, in this moment of grace, they had found sanctuary, not just from the cold, but from the winter in their souls. The first shot shattered the pre-dawn stillness like breaking glass. Ethan jerked awake on his cot, years of mountain instincts bringing him upright before his mind fully cleared. Through the church's frosted windows, he caught the orange flicker of torches moving in the darkness. More shots crackled, splintering wood. The acrid smell of smoke drifted under the door. Ethan snatched up his rifle and ran to where Mira slept. "They've found us," he whispered, touching her shoulder. She came awake instantly, fear and determination mingling in her eyes. Reverend Cole burst in from his quarters, shotgun in hand. "Back door's blocked. They've got us surrounded." Orange light blazed brighter outside as flames began to lick at the church's front porch. Smoke curled through gaps in the weathered boards. Ethan's mind raced. They were trapped, outgunned, with precious little time. "Behind the pulpit," he ordered Mira, guiding her toward the altar. "Stay low." She clutched the deed to her chest as she crouched behind the wooden lectern. Cole took position by a side window, shotgun ready. Ethan moved to cover the front door just as another volley of bullets punched through, sending splinters flying. "Come out, Virgin!" Crowley's voice boomed from outside. "Ain't no shame in knowing when you're beat." Ethan didn't waste breath responding. He sighted down his rifle barrel as shadows moved across the windows. A figure darted past. He squeezed the trigger, not to kill but to warn. The shot went high, and the shadow disappeared. Smoke was thickening now, making his eyes water. The flames had taken hold of the porch, casting wild shadows through the windows. In their orange glare, Ethan caught glimpses of men moving into position around the church. A bullet struck the Bible on the lectern, sending leather and paper flying. Mira flinched but stayed silent, pressing herself lower behind the pulpit. Cole's shotgun roared, answered by a cry of pain from outside. "Last chance, Boone," Crowley called. "Send her out now, we'll let you walk away. Keep playing, hero, and you'll burn with this church." Ethan's shoulder burned as he worked the rifle's lever action. The smoke was getting worse, making it hard to breathe. He could hear Mira coughing behind him. The front door exploded inward in a shower of splinters and flame. Crowley stood silhouetted in the doorway, gun raised, his badge gleaming in the firelight. Two more men flanked him, rifles ready. "You should have kept to your mountain, Virgin," Crowley sneered, stepping inside. "Some things ain't meant for holy men." Ethan shifted, keeping himself between Crowley and the pulpit where Mira huddled. His rifle stayed level, though his arms ached from the strain. "She ain't yours," Ethan said quietly. "Never was. Law says different." Crowley's smile was cold as winter. "Her daddy's debts make her my lawful wife. Ain't nothing to do with want." "The law says no such thing," Cole spoke up from his position. "You're twisting God's word and man's law both, Sheriff." Crowley's gun swung toward the preacher. "Stay out of this, Reverend, lest you want to meet your maker early." Everything happened at once. Mira rose from behind the pulpit, the deed held high. "I have proof," she cried. "This land was never yours to—" Crowley's gun barked. Ethan lunged, shoving Mira aside as fire exploded in his shoulder. He stumbled, rifle clattering to the floor. Through a haze of pain, he saw the deed slip from Mira's fingers, floating like a leaf towards the flames that now licked at the floorboards. "No!" Mira reached for it, but Crowley was faster. He grabbed her arm, yanking her away as the precious document caught fire, curling and blackening in seconds. "Ain't that a shame?" Crowley said, watching the deed burn to ash. "Guess it's just your word against mine now, girl." Ethan tried to rise, but his wounded shoulder wouldn't support him. He collapsed against the altar rail, blood seeping between his fingers where he clutched the wound. Through darkening vision, he saw Cole lying motionless by the window, felled by one of Crowley's men. "Time to go home, wife," Crowley said, dragging Mira toward the door. She fought him, reaching toward Ethan with desperate eyes. "Ethan!" she cried. "Please, God, help him!" But Ethan could only watch as Crowley pulled her into the smoke-filled night. His strength was fading, the church spinning around him as he slumped against the altar. The flames were spreading now, consuming the simple wooden cross above. "Lord," he whispered, blood staining his lips, "protect her soul. She deserves better than this." The last thing he saw before consciousness fled was the moon through the smoke-filled windows, cold and distant as mercy. Then darkness took him, and he knew no more. Behind him the flames climbed higher, consuming the little church where hope had bloomed so briefly. Outside, hoofbeats faded into the pre-dawn darkness, carrying Mira back to the prison she had fled. The deed that could have saved them all was nothing but ash, scattered by the bitter mountain wind. In the burning church, Ethan lay still as death before the altar, his blood staining the wooden steps where just hours before he had found the courage to sing again. Now only the crackling of flames broke the silence, as if heaven itself held its breath at the tragedy unfolding below. The night grew colder, and hope seemed as distant as the stars above Silver Creek, hidden now behind clouds of smoke that rose like prayers into the darkened sky. Pain came. First, deep, throbbing waves that pulsed with each heartbeat. Then awareness crept in slowly, like dawn breaking over mountain peaks. Ethan's eyes fluttered open to unfamiliar shadows dancing on rough stone walls. He tried to move, but found himself wrapped in thick furs, his shoulder bound tight with bandages that smelled of herbs and smoke. "Be still, brother," a familiar voice said softly. "The spirit walk is not yet done." Through the haze of fever, he made out Nijoni's weathered face bent over him, her silver hair gleaming in firelight. Two younger Ute men sat cross-legged nearby, watching with dark, careful eyes. "The church," Ethan rasped, his throat raw from smoke. "Mira." "Gone," Nijoni said simply, pressing a wooden cup to his lips. "Drink. The medicine will help clear your mind." The bitter liquid burned going down, but it helped chase away some of the fog. Ethan's memories came flooding back. Gunfire, flames, Crowley's sneering face, and Mira's desperate cry as she was dragged away. His heart clenched with shame and grief. "How?" he started to ask. "My grandsons found you," Nijoni explained, gesturing to the two men. 2 days ago, half dead in the burning church, they carried you here, to this hidden place where even the sheriff's dogs cannot track. Ethan closed his eyes against sudden tears. I failed her. Failed God's test. No. Najoni's voice was firm as mountain stone. You showed love's courage. That is never failure. But fever was rising again, bringing with it waves of delirium. Ethan tossed beneath the firs, muttering prayers and broken pieces of his past. He saw again the woman in Kansas, falling as his crafted gun misfired in another's hands, heard his own voice swearing never to cause harm again, to remain pure and untouched by worldly desires. Through it all, Najoni sat beside him, changing poultices and singing soft, healing songs in her native tongue. When lucidity returned, she was still there, her kind eyes filled with ancient wisdom. You suffer from 2 wounds, she said, touching his bandaged shoulder gently. One from lead, one from fear. The first will heal clean. The second, she shook her head. That depends on what you believe about love. Ethan struggled to sit up, though it made his head spin. I made a vow, he whispered, to stay pure, to never harm or feel, Najoni finished. You were never meant to be untouched by love, only by harm. She reached for her medicine pouch, adding, The great voice does not ask us to wall up our hearts, only to use them wisely. Her words struck him like summer lightning, illuminating dark corners of his soul he'd long kept shadowed. All these years, had he confused purity with emptiness? Had his vow become another kind of violence, against his own spirit? Crowley, he said suddenly, remembering. What news? One of Najoni's grandsons spoke up in careful English. He plans big ceremony, 3 days from now, to marry the woman in front of whole town, show everyone she is his property. Ethan's hands clenched in the furs. He can't. The deed was burned, Najoni reminded him gently, but not before others saw it. The preacher, Cole, he lives, though badly hurt. He can testify it existed. Hope flickered faintly. The U.S. Marshal in Durango, Ethan said. If he knew. Najoni nodded, understanding in her eyes. You wish me to send word? Please. Ethan met her gaze. I know it's much to ask, but it is nothing, she interrupted. Justice speaks in many tongues. My riders are swift, and the marshal knows me from translation work at the agency. She touched the medicine pouch at her belt. I will go myself, with proof of the deed's existence. My word carries weight with him. Relief washed through Ethan, followed quickly by determination. He pushed back the furs, ignoring the pain that shot through his shoulder. I need my horse. You are not yet strong enough, one of the younger men protested. No, Ethan agreed, forcing himself to stand despite the way the cave tilted around him. But I'm strong enough for this. Najoni studied him for a long moment, then nodded to her grandsons. They rose smoothly, disappearing into the ravine outside. When they returned, they led Ethan's bay gelding, already saddled. The fever may return, Najoni warned, pressing a small bundle of herbs into his hand. Chew these if your vision blurs, but remember, the greatest medicine is already in your heart. Ethan tucked the herbs into his shirt pocket, then turned to face her fully. I don't know how to thank you. Live with an open heart, she replied simply. That is thanks enough. The effort of mounting nearly drove him back into darkness, but Ethan clung to consciousness with grim determination. From the saddle, he looked down at Najoni and her grandsons, these good people who had saved him without question. God be with you, he said softly. Najoni smiled. He never left. Go now. Find your destiny. As Ethan rode carefully out of the ravine, he heard her begin a prayer song behind him, the ancient words rising like smoke into the morning air. His shoulder throbbed with each step of his horse, but his mind was clearing, his purpose crystallizing like frost on pine needles. He had been wrong, so wrong, about the nature of purity. True purity wasn't the absence of feeling. It was the presence of selfless love. The kind that would give everything, risk everything, to protect another's soul from harm. The kind that burned in his heart now, stronger than fever, stronger than pain. The kind that would face down a corrupt sheriff and all his men, armed with nothing but truth and faith. Ethan turned his horse toward town, toward wherever Mira was being held. The morning sun caught the snow-capped peaks ahead, setting them ablaze with light. Behind him, Nijoni's song faded into the wind, but its strength remained, holding him upright in the saddle as he began the long ride down from the mountains. He might still fail, might even die trying. But at least now he understood. Love wasn't a test to pass or fail. It was the very breath of God, moving through human hearts, making them whole. With that knowledge burning in his chest like a star, Ethan rode on, letting his horse pick its way carefully down the trail as the sun climbed higher over Silver Ridge. Somewhere ahead, Mira waited. Somewhere ahead, justice waited too. And this time, when he faced Crowley, it wouldn't be with a rifle in his hands, but with the full power of love's truth in his heart. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across melting snowdrifts as Ethan guided his horse through icy streams. Each step jolted his wounded shoulder, sending waves of pain through his fever-weakened body. The medicine herbs from Nijoni helped clear his head, but couldn't chase away the bone-deep exhaustion that made even staying upright a struggle. Yet he pressed on, following the familiar trail down from the high country. His mount picked its way carefully over rocks slick with snowmelt, hooves splashing through shallow creek crossings. The gelding seemed to sense its rider's condition, moving with careful steadiness despite the treacherous ground. As they descended into more familiar territory, Ethan's heart clenched at the sight of scorched timber and blackened ruins. Crowley's path of destruction clearly marked across the mountainside. His own workshop lay ahead, and he drew rein beside its charred remains. Sliding carefully from the saddle, Ethan steadied himself against his horse's warm shoulder. The workshop where he'd once crafted guns with such pride was now just a hollow shell. Burned timber crackled under his boots as he made his way inside, drawn by something half buried in the ashes. There, beneath fallen beams, lay the broken wooden cross he'd carved as a young man. He remembered hanging it above his workbench, a daily reminder of grace. Now it was split clean through, blackened by flame but still solid at its core. With trembling hands, Ethan lifted the cross, brushing away soot to reveal grain still bright beneath. Memory washed over him. How he'd fled here after that tragic accident in Kansas, thinking isolation would keep his soul pure. How wrong he'd been, mistaking emptiness for holiness. "I'll carry you this time," he whispered, voice rough with emotion. Using strips torn from his shirt, he lashed the broken cross to his saddle horn. It rode there like a beacon as he mounted again, pointing the way forward through gathering dusk. The town emerged from evening shadows, lights glowing in scattered windows. But it was the church that drew his eye. Windows blazing, bell tower dark against deepening purple sky. As if on cue, the bells began to toll, their bronze voices rolling across rooftops and empty streets. Crowley's wedding. The thought sent ice through Ethan's veins, but he forced down his fear. Around him, townspeople emerged from their homes, and businesses, drawn toward the church like moths to flame. Some walked quickly, heads down, while others lingered to whisper in clusters. All bore the weight of fear mixed with morbid curiosity. Ethan recognized their expressions. The same careful blankness he'd seen in Kansas when good people chose silence over standing against wrong. But this time would be different. This time, truth would speak. He reined in beside the church's hitching post, body protesting as he dismounted for what felt like the 100th time that day. His rifle remained in its scabbard. He wouldn't need it, wouldn't touch it. The broken cross caught lamplight as he untied it from his saddle, holding it like a staff, as he turned toward the church steps. Each step sent daggers of pain through his shoulder, but Ethan kept his head high. Nijoni's herbs had worn off, leaving him pale and shaking, yet somehow stronger than before. Through the open church doors, light spilled onto the wooden porch, carrying with it the murmur of gathered voices and the scratch of boot heels on plank flooring. He paused at the threshold, one hand pressed against the doorframe for support. The broken cross weighed heavy in his other grip, but its presence steadied him. This was what real faith looked like. Not hiding on a mountain, but walking unarmed into darkness, carrying nothing but truth and trust in something greater than himself. Lamplight caught his shadow, stretching it long across the church steps. Behind him, the evening's first star winked to life above Silver Ridge. Ahead lay danger, corruption, and the woman he'd finally learned to love purely. Ethan took a deep breath, tasting wood smoke and spring mud and the sharp tang of his own fear. Then, leaning on the broken cross like a pilgrim's staff, he stepped into the light of the open doorway, ready to face whatever waited within. Not as the Virgin of Silver Ridge, but as a man who'd finally understood that love was the purest prayer of all. Inside the church, lamplight flickered across rough-hewn pews packed with worried faces. At the altar, Mira stood in a torn white dress, her shoulders straight despite the trembling in her hands. The cross-shaped brand on her neck seemed to glow in the golden light, a testament to the cruelty that had brought her here. Sheriff Crowley paced before the assembled witnesses, his boots striking the floorboards like hammer blows. "Good folks of Silver Ridge," he called out, spreading his arms wide. "You're here to witness my lawful claim, not just to this fine bride, but to the Dawson Basin itself, land and lady, joined under God's own sky." The crowd shifted uncomfortably, no one daring to meet their neighbor's eyes. Then came the soft tap of boots in the doorway. Ethan stood there, pale as morning frost, supporting himself with the charred cross from his workshop. His hat hung loose in one hand, revealing hair darkened with fever sweat. "Love suffereth long and is kind," he said, his quiet voice carrying to every corner of the church. "Love envieth not, love vaunteth not itself, is not puffed up." People turned in their seats, recognition dawning. The Virgin of Silver Ridge, speaking the words from 1 Corinthians chapter 13. "Doth not behave itself unseemly," Ethan continued, taking a step forward. "Seeketh not her own, is not easily provoked, thinketh no evil." Crowley's face twisted. "You dare quote scripture at me, mountain man?" He lunged forward, reaching for his gun. But something had changed in the crowd. 3 men from the lumber mill stood up, catching Crowley's arms. Others rose too, forming a wall between him and Mira. Years of fear were breaking like spring ice. Heavy boots sounded on the church steps. United States Marshal Caleb Harker filled the doorway, his badge catching lamplight. Behind him stood 2 Ute riders, their faces grave and dignified. "Rand Crowley," Harker's voice rang out, unfolding an official paper. "By authority of the Territory of Colorado, you're under arrest for arson, land fraud, and the abduction of Miss Mira Dawson." Mira broke free from the altar, running to Ethan. She caught him just as his strength failed, helping him sink onto a front pew. His wounded shoulder had begun bleeding again, dark spots spreading across his shirt. You came back, she whispered, pressing her forehead to his. Couldn't let you marry a man who doesn't know what love means, Ethan managed, his voice rough with pain and exhaustion. As Harker led Crowley away in irons, someone in the back began to sing. Others joined in, their voices rising in the old hymn, Amazing Grace. The sound filled every corner of the church, washing away months of fear and silence. Justice had come at last to Silver Ridge, carried not by guns or violence, but by faith, truth, and the courage to stand against darkness with nothing but love as a shield. Weeks melted into the warmth of spring, and the San Juan Mountains shed their white mantle. Fresh green painted the valleys, dotted with tiny wildflowers pushing through patches of lingering snow. Along the creek where Reverend Dawson's old cabin had stood, hammers rang out against new pine boards. Ethan worked steadily, his wounded shoulder healing strong. He'd designed the new cabin larger than before, with extra rooms for travelers and those needing shelter. Mira had insisted on that, a place of refuge, just as Nijoni's hut had been for them. The elderly healer's wisdom seemed to echo in the way they built each wall with prayer and purpose. The Ute children came often, their laughter brightening the construction site. They brought offerings from Nijoni, bundles of sage, willow bark, and sweet herbs tied with colored string. For healing, they would say in careful English, placing the gifts in Mira's hands. She taught them letters while Ethan showed them how to shape wood, building bridges between worlds with simple kindness. The cabin grew day by day. Wide windows faced east to catch the morning light. A deep porch wrapped around three sides, ready to welcome weary travelers. Inside, Mira arranged her father's rescued books on rough-hewn shelves, while Ethan crafted a table long enough for 12, a promise of community restored. They worked side by side, careful not to brush too close, yet bound by something deeper than touch. Ethan's vow remained unbroken, but it had transformed from a wall into a bridge. He found he could love purely, serving others without fear of his own desires. As evening painted the peaks in shades of fire, they finished the hearth, the heart of any home. Ethan laid the final stone while Mira swept the new wooden floor. The first fire crackled to life, filling the cabin with warmth and dancing shadows. Mira knelt beside him, her eyes reflecting the flames. The cross-shaped scar on her neck had faded some, but it remained a testament to survival. Without speaking, she took his calloused hand in hers. "I still can't touch you the way a man does," Ethan said softly, his voice rough with emotion. "My vow." She smiled through gathering tears, squeezing his fingers. "You've touched me more deeply than any man ever could." Her words fell gentle as spring rain. "You showed me that love isn't about possession, it's about protection, about lifting each other toward heaven." Outside, the creek sang its endless song through the pines. Snowmelt from the high country rushed down, bringing new life to the valley. Soon, summer would paint the meadows with columbine and Indian paintbrush. Already, the land was healing from Crowley's fires. Ethan bowed his head, feeling peace settle over him like a familiar blanket. The weight of guilt he'd carried for so many years finally lifted. He understood now that his vow had never been about denial. It had been preparation for this deeper love, this holy partnership of souls. The Virgin of Silver Ridge had found his calling not in isolation, but in opening his heart to serve others. With Mira beside him, their joined hands bridging past and future, he felt God's grace as tangible as sunlight on his skin. The fire popped and sparked, sending embers dancing up the chimney toward the stars. In that moment, the cabin truly became a home, not just for them, but for all who would seek shelter in its walls. Their love story would be told in every meal shared at the long table, every traveler given rest, every wound bound with Nijoni's healing herbs. And through it all, the morning star would rise over Silver Ridge, blessing this place where faith had finally flowered into perfect peace. Thanks for tuning in. These stories remind us that life is more than headlines. It's about heartlines. Subscribe if you want more moments that make you pause, feel, and reflect.